Living in this house is just priceless. Every hour is priceless. I mean, living in a regular house with walls could never be like this. The key, particularly at night, is when you have 4 walls of glass, you don't have the reflection of the back wall out in front of the front wall. And if the light is all direct, you don't have all your lights and your furniture and everything sitting out in the front yard. If you have a regular house, everything is reflected in the glass. When Johnson first came, spent his first night in this house, I don't know if you know the story, he called up and said, "Oh," he said, it's terrible. All there is me. There's just me and me and me and me and me. And that's the way a glass house is, unless you get the light in the house very low. And bring the light up outside. And I think when he put these fixtures around the outside, they nailed them through the roof, which was one of the big problems he had at first. And the roof all leaked. When Philip Johnson first held out his shingle, he decided he was going to work out of New Canaan. So he had an office on 88 Main Street in New Canaan upstairs. But then he decided that wasn't going to work out. So he moved to New York. And then Louis Lee decided that maybe he would rather have an office. So we took over Philip Johnson's office in New Canaan and eventually moved the whole company there. When Philip Johnson built this house in the 40s, they had a lot of problems. It had a local builder, but they had a lot of problems with it, getting it sort of going. And he turned to Louis Lee in New York to see if he could come out here and fix the house up. And that started a long association between Louis Lee and Philip Johnson, which included the Boisonnas house in New Canaan, the Hennessy house across the road here. He built the guest house for the Rockefellers on the east side of New York, amongst other things, amongst other buildings here. So, deciding that once you built one industrial plant, you built them all, I decided I'd come back here to New Canaan and see if he'd hire me. And I got a job with Louis Lee, who was sort of interested because I was an engineer at Yale, so was he. And none of his children were really interested in his business. So I started working for him. He was already getting quite old. And one day after the fall, I started in the spring, maybe in the fall sometime, I think in the fall of '68, came to me and he said, "You know, Port, I think there's a client that I think you should meet, and an account you should begin to think about, you should take over. Be a good account for you." And so I got in this car and we drove for the usual Saturday meeting. We drove down this driveway and I got out of the car and I walked around the corner and looked at this house and walking up to this house, and I just realized that if you ever lived in anything like this, you could never go back to a regular house. And I never went back to a regular house. I went home to my little house in Row 8 and tore out all the walls. And we lived, everybody could look in. We had no privacy. My poor wife and kids had to live outside. And then I've never lived in anything that wasn't mostly glass ever since. A glass house is wonderful to live in. You sit inside, and because it's darker inside than outside, the animals come right up and wander around the house because they can't see you, but you can see them. So that you're really living outside, particularly at night. And then, of course, this house just looks into the sunset over High Ridge Road. And sometimes I would cheat a little bit and tell him I couldn't meet him in the morning. Could I see him on a fall afternoon at 4 o'clock? And I'd come down here, and the sun was going down, just to come in here and sit and watch the sunset. It is fabulous. It's just a fabulous way of living. But then I started coming to meet him every single week. And in those days, he worked 5 days, so it would be on Saturday morning. I would come here at 10 or 11 o'clock on a Saturday morning, and we'd sit at that marble table. And he'd have something that he'd been thinking about. He was quick, and he was always excited about some idea that he'd thought up during the week. To work, what you have to realize, people have to realize, is that Johnson never came here except to have fun. This was where he came to have fun. And he had no interest in anything else if it wasn't fun. He never worried about anything. He never complained about anything because that wouldn't have been fun. He never criticized anything. Even when the mistakes happened, and they did happen, he never complained about the mistakes. He never would bring it up. That would be fun. That would put a crimp on our relationship. It would put a crimp on the fun, on just having fun. So I would come here, and he would have some fun project that he'd been thinking about, like moving rocks. We moved a lot of rocks. He didn't like the rocks here. He wanted them moved over there. I would come out here, and we dig under the rock, and we get a machine and get carefully under the rock, and we lift it up so we didn't make any scratches on the lichen, because it never repairs itself. So we'd move the rock carefully over and put it in another place. Then he'd come down and said, oh gosh, he says, maybe I should have moved it over a little bit more over there. But we moved rocks, we moved things around, we pruned trees. He would always see something. And then it never made any difference. You'd walk up to the table, and he wanted to build a new building. This house and Philip Johnson went one huge step beyond that, because this house the interior is tightly organized without boundaries. Only this space has no exterior walls. That is really the difference. You don't live in the glass house. You live in the site.